The crack of a gunshot echoed across the parched Montana landscape as Grace Ellis clutched her tattered skirt, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild stallion. It was 1878, and the promise of a new life on her recently deceased father's homestead had just shattered with the arrival of Silas Montgomery and his band of land-grabbing outlaws. "You ain't got no choice in the matter, Miss Ellis," Silas snarled, his tobacco-stained teeth visible beneath his unkempt mustache. "Your pa owed me, and I'm collecting. Either you marry my boy Jasper here, or we burn this place to the ground with you in it." Grace's amber eyes darted from Silas to his son Jasper, a mean-spirited youth barely older than her 20 summers, whose hungry gaze made her skin crawl. Behind them, 3 more men lounged against the porch railing, fingers hovering near their holsters. "My father owed you nothing," Grace declared, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. "These papers prove this land is rightfully mine." She clutched the deed to her chest, the last connection to her father's dream. Silas's laugh was cold as a winter creek. "Papers don't mean much out here, girl. Judge Wilson sees things my way." He nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward and snatched the deed from Grace's hands. "The wedding happens tomorrow," Silas continued, motioning for Jasper to grab Grace's arm. "Till then, you'll stay put." Grace struggled against Jasper's iron grip. "I would rather die than marry into your family of thieves." Jasper slapped her hard across the face, sending her stumbling backward. "You'll learn respect soon enough, wife." Grace's eyes watered from the sting, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Her mind raced with desperate plans of escape, but the men had already stationed themselves around the small cabin, cutting off any chance of fleeing. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, Grace sat by the window, a prisoner in her own home. Silas and his men had helped themselves to her father's whiskey, growing louder and more threatening with each passing hour. "Come tomorrow, all this land joins the Montgomery holdings," Silas boasted, sprawling in her father's chair. "And you'll be bearing my grandchildren before the year is out." Grace shuddered, her fingers unconsciously tracing the small silver locket around her neck, her mother's last gift before succumbing to fever 3 winters past. Inside was a small portrait of her parents on their wedding day, a reminder of what real love looked like. Night fell like a shroud over the homestead. Through the cabin's single window, Grace watched a storm gathering on the horizon, lightning illuminating the distant mountains. Perhaps, she thought, the elements themselves were conspiring to prevent this forced union. Sleep evaded her as she lay on her bed, fully clothed, listening to the occasional burst of laughter from the men keeping watch outside. Her father's hunting rifle had been the first thing they'd taken, along with any potential weapon she might have used to defend herself. Morning arrived with cruel swiftness. Grace had managed only a few fitful moments of rest when Jasper kicked open her bedroom door. "Rise and shine, bride," he sneered, tossing a bundle of fabric onto her bed. "Pa brought you something pretty to wear." Grace stared at the yellowed wedding dress with revulsion. It had clearly seen better days, the once white lace now stained and torn in places. "Belonged to Jasper's mama," Silas called from the main room. "God rest her soul." "I won't wear this," Grace said, pushing the dress away. "I won't marry him." Silas appeared in the doorway, his patience visibly thinning. "You will wear it, and you will say your vows, or we start shooting them horses you love so much, one by one." He patted the gun on his hip. "Starting with that pretty Palomino." Grace's resolve faltered. The horses were her livelihood and her companions, especially Sunflower, the Palomino mare her father had given her for her 16th birthday. She couldn't bear to see them harmed. "You have 1 hour," Silas declared, closing the door behind him. With trembling hands, Grace reluctantly changed into the dress, its musty scent making her stomach turn. She pinned up her chestnut hair as best she could without a mirror, her mind still desperately searching for an escape. Outside, she could hear the men preparing for the mockery of a ceremony. Jasper's drunken voice carried through the thin walls as he boasted about his wedding night plans to his father's men. When Silas returned, he grabbed Grace's arm and dragged her into the main room. A stranger in a worn suit, waited there, presumably someone masquerading as a minister to give their sham wedding a veneer of legitimacy. "Let's get this over with," Silas ordered, cocking his pistol and pointing it at Grace's temple. "No more delays." The false minister nervously opened a tattered Bible, but before he could speak, the cabin door burst open with such force that it nearly tore from its hinges. Silhouetted against the morning light stood a tall figure, six-shooter raised and steady. "I reckon this ain't what the lady wants," came a deep, measured voice that seemed to fill the small cabin with its authority. The stranger stepped inside, revealing himself to be a lean, broad-shouldered man with piercing blue eyes beneath the brim of a dusty brown hat. His face was weathered from years under the sun, but Grace guessed him to be no more than 30. A sheriff's badge gleamed on his chest. "Blake O'Malley," he introduced himself, his gun unwavering as it pointed directly at Silas, "Sheriff of Whispering Pines. And you boys are trespassing on this lady's property." Silas's face contorted with rage. "This ain't your jurisdiction, O'Malley, and we're having ourselves a wedding, not a crime." "Forcing a woman to marry at gunpoint is a crime anywhere I stand," Sheriff O'Malley replied calmly, his eyes briefly meeting Grace's. "Miss, are you here of your own free will?" "No," Grace answered, her voice finding new strength. "They threatened to kill me and my horses if I didn't marry his son." The sheriff nodded, his expression hardening. "That's what I figured when your neighbor rode into town this morning, saying he'd seen armed men taking over the Ellis place." Jasper lunged toward his gun, but Blake fired a warning shot that splintered the floorboards near Jasper's feet, freezing him mid-motion. "Next one won't be a warning," Blake stated. "All of you drop your weapons, now." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Silas, calculating his odds, slowly placed his pistol on the table. His men reluctantly followed suit. "This ain't over," Silas growled. "This land will be mine one way or another. Not today it won't," Blake replied. "Now all of you outside, my deputies are waiting." True to his word, 2 mounted deputies waited in the yard, rifles ready. Under their watchful eyes, Silas and his men were disarmed and their hands bound. "Judge Wilson will have you badge for this, O'Malley," Silas threatened as one of the deputies helped him onto his horse. Blake's expression remained impassive. "Judge Wilson's been replaced by a federal appointee. Your days of corrupting local officials are over, Montgomery." As the deputies led the prisoners away, Blake turned to Grace, his stern demeanor softening. "Are you hurt, Miss Ellis?" Grace shook her head, suddenly aware of how she must look in the stained wedding dress. "No, just shaken." She attempted to smooth the wrinkles from the yellowed fabric. "Thank you, Sheriff, if you hadn't arrived when you did." "Call me Blake," he said, removing his hat. "And you don't need to thank me. It's my job to protect the people in these parts." He glanced at the dress with a hint of sympathy in his eyes. "I reckon you'd like to change before we head into town to file your statement." Grace nodded gratefully and hurried to her bedroom, eager to shed the hateful garment. She changed quickly into a simple blue calico dress, her hands still unsteady from the morning's events. When she emerged, Blake was examining the deed that one of Montgomery's men had discarded on the table. "Everything appears in order," he said, handing the document to Grace. "But Silas Montgomery has been trying to consolidate land in this valley for years. He won't give up easily, even from behind bars." "I can't leave," Grace replied, tucking the deed safely into her pocket. "This land was my father's dream. It's all I have left of him." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that feeling." His eyes surveyed the modest cabin and the land beyond. "It's a fine piece of property, but it's a lot for one person to manage alone." "I've been managing since my father fell ill 2 years ago," Grace said with quiet pride. "I can handle it." A smile touched Blake's lips. "I don't doubt that, Miss Ellis, but even the strongest among us need allies." He replaced his hat and moved toward the door. "I'll have a deputy ride by regularly until we're certain Montgomery's men don't try anything else." As they stepped outside, Grace noticed the storm clouds had dispersed, leaving behind a brilliant blue sky. She took a deep breath of the clean mountain air, feeling as though she'd been granted a second chance. "Would you like me to escort you into town?" Blake asked. Untying his horse from the hitching post, Grace hesitated, looking around at her homestead. There was work to be done, animals to feed, fences to mend, but she knew giving her statement was important to ensure Silas and his men remained locked up. Yes, thank you, she decided. Just let me tend to the horses first. Together they walked to the small corral where Grace's 5 horses watched them curiously. Sunflower, the Palomino mare, trotted over immediately, nickering softly as Grace stroked her velvety nose. She's beautiful, Blake commented, his hand joining Grace's in patting the horse. Arabian blood. Quarter horse and Arabian, Grace confirmed, impressed by his knowledge. My father bred horses before his health failed. I've tried to continue his work. Blake nodded appreciatively. You've done well. These are fine animals. His eyes lingered on a young bay stallion at the back of the corral. Especially that one, good conformation. That's Thunder, Grace said, a hint of pride in her voice. He's still green, but he shows promise. She hesitated, then added, Do you ride, Sheriff? All my life, Blake replied with a small smile. My father ran a small ranch near Laramie before the war, taught me everything I know about horses. As Grace fed and watered her animals, she found herself sharing more about her life, how her parents had homesteaded this land when she was just a child, how she'd learned to hunt and fish alongside her father, and how they'd weathered the harsh Montana winters together. Blake listened attentively, occasionally offering stories of his own upbringing in Wyoming and his journey to becoming sheriff of Whispering Pines 3 years earlier. By the time they mounted their horses for the ride to town, Grace felt a comfort in Blake's presence that she hadn't expected, a sense that she could trust this quiet, steadfast man who had appeared like an avenging angel just when she needed him most. The town of Whispering Pines was a small but growing settlement nestled in a valley 15 miles from Grace's homestead. As they rode in, Grace noticed the curious glances from townsfolk, many of whom she recognized from her infrequent supply trips. Word travels fast, Blake explained, noting her discomfort at the attention. But don't worry, most folks here have no love for Silas Montgomery. They'll be glad you stood your ground. At the sheriff's office, Grace gave her statement to a clerk while Blake checked on the prisoners. When he returned, his expression was grim. Judge Parker won't arrive for his circuit for another 2 weeks, he informed her. We'll hold them until then, but I'm concerned about their associates. Montgomery has hired guns scattered throughout the territory. Grace felt her momentary sense of security evaporate. You think they might try something? It's a possibility we should prepare for, Blake answered honestly. Do you have somewhere else you could stay until the trial? Grace shook her head. The homestead is all I have. And I can't abandon my animals. Blake considered this, then offered, I could arrange for additional patrols, but we're stretched thin as it is. He hesitated before continuing, or I could stay at your property myself, just until things settle. There's that line shack near your north pasture that would serve well enough. Grace felt her cheeks warm at his suggestion. It wasn't proper for an unmarried woman to have a man staying on her property, but these were hardly normal circumstances. I wouldn't want to impose on your duties here, she said carefully. My deputy can handle things for a few days, Blake assured her. Your safety is more important right now. After a moment's consideration, Grace nodded. Thank you, Sheriff, I accept your offer. As they prepared to leave town, Blake insisted on stopping at the general store to purchase supplies: coffee, flour, bacon, and ammunition. Grace protested that she could manage, but Blake was firm. Consider it the town's way of apologizing for not dealing with Montgomery sooner, he said, settling the bill with the storekeeper. The ride back to the homestead was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the western mountains. When they arrived, Blake immediately set about checking the property's perimeter while Grace unloaded the supplies. That evening, they shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread at Grace's rough-hewn table. The domesticity of the scene wasn't lost on Grace. It had been years since she'd shared her table with anyone other than her father. Tell me about your father, Blake requested as they finished their meal. He must have been a remarkable man to raise such a capable daughter. Grace smiled, the memories both painful and precious. He was Thomas Ellis, former cavalry sergeant turned horse breeder and dreamer. After my mother died, it was just the two of us against the world. She traced the grain of the wooden table with her finger. "He taught me everything: how to shoot, how to track, how to berth a foal in the middle of a snowstorm." "He would be proud of how you've carried on," Blake said softly. Grace blinked back unexpected tears. "I hope so. Sometimes I worry that I'm not doing enough, that I'm letting his dream fade." "Dreams change shape," Blake offered, "but they don't die as long as someone remembers them." He stood and gathered their plates. "Rest tonight. I'll take the first watch and wake you if anything seems amiss." Over the next 3 days, a routine developed between them. Blake slept in the line shack, but spent his days helping Grace with the countless tasks required to maintain the homestead. They mended fences together, tended the vegetable garden, and exercised the horses. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and purple. Their conversations grew easier, more personal. Grace learned about Blake's service during the final year of the Civil War, though he spoke little of the details, and his decision to head west afterward in search of purpose. "I drifted for a while," he admitted on the third night, cleaning his revolver by lamplight while Grace darned a sock. "Worked as a ranch hand, briefly rode with a cattle drive, even tried my hand at prospecting." He chuckled softly. "Found more blisters than gold." "What made you become a sheriff?" Grace asked, looking up from her mending. Blake was silent for a moment, his hands stilling on the gun. "I witnessed a land dispute turn violent in a small town in Colorado. An entire family killed over boundary lines that weren't worth the paper they were drawn on." His jaw tightened at the memory. "The local law did nothing because the killer had connections. I decided then that I wanted to stand for something better." Grace felt a new respect bloom within her chest. "You're a good man, Blake O'Malley." His eyes met hers, warm despite their icy blue color. "I try to be." The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with a hint of autumn in the air despite the summer date. Grace rose early to find Blake already at work in the corral, exercising thunder with a natural skill that made her pause to watch. The young stallion, usually wary with strangers, responded to Blake's quiet commands with surprising willingness. Man and horse moved in harmony, their mutual respect evident in every smooth transition. "You've got away with him," Grace observed as Blake dismounted and led Thunder to the water trough. Blake patted the horse's sleek neck. "He's intelligent, wants to please, but needs to know you respect his spirit." His eyes found Grace's. "Reminds me of someone else I've come to know." Grace felt a flutter in her chest at his words and the intensity of his gaze. To hide her reaction, she busied herself with gathering eggs from the small henhouse. "I was thinking," Blake said, following her with Thunder still in tow, "your south pasture would benefit from irrigation. The creek could be diverted with minimal effort." Grace nodded, impressed by his observation. "My father always talked about doing that, never had the time before he fell ill." "I could help you start the work before I head back to town," Blake offered. "It would increase your grazing capacity considerably." The reminder that Blake would soon return to his duties sent an unexpected pang through Grace's heart. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the security and companionship he provided. "That would be kind of you," she managed, trying to keep her voice neutral. They spent the day mapping out the irrigation project and gathering the necessary tools. As they worked side by side under the Montana sun, Grace found herself stealing glances at Blake, the way his strong hands handled tools with precision, how the sunlight caught in his dark hair when he removed his hat to wipe his brow, the occasional smile that transformed his serious face. She was falling for him, Grace realized with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. 4 days ago, he had been a stranger who saved her from a forced marriage. Now, she couldn't imagine her life without his steady presence. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, a comfortable silence settled between them. Grace had brought out a jug of her father's homemade cider, and they passed it between them, shoulders nearly touching on the narrow bench. "I received word from town today," Blake finally said, his voice cutting gently through the quiet. "One of my deputies rode out while you were tending the garden." Grace turned to him, sensing something important in his tone. "What news?" "Silas Montgomery's gang tried to break him out of jail last night," Blake replied, his expression grave. They didn't succeed, but 2 of my deputies were injured in the attempt. Grace gasped softly. Are they all right? They will be, Blake assured her. But it means I need to return to town tomorrow. My presence is needed there more urgently now. Though she had expected this moment, the reality of it still stung. Grace nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. Of course, your deputies need you. Blake studied her face in the fading light. I don't like leaving you unprotected. I survived before you arrived, Grace reminded him, attempting a brave smile. I'll manage. Grace, Blake said softly, using her given name for the first time. I've been thinking about your situation, and I have a proposition for you. Grace's heart quickened. What kind of proposition? A business arrangement of sorts, Blake continued, his usual confidence seemingly tempered with uncertainty. I own a small piece of land just outside of town. Not much, just 10 acres with a cabin that needs work. It was meant to be my retirement plan someday. Grace waited, unsure where he was leading. What if we combined our resources? Blake suggested. Your knowledge of horses and my land near town where you could establish a proper breeding operation. Closer to customers, safer from men like Montgomery, Grace blinked in surprise. Are you asking me to be your business partner? For now, Blake said, his eyes never leaving hers, though I hope it might lead to something more in time. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Blake, Grace began carefully, we've known each other less than a week. I know, he acknowledged with a rueful smile, and if you think I'm being too forward, I'll understand. But in my line of work, I've learned to recognize what's valuable and worth pursuing. His hand found hers on the bench between them. And Grace Ellis, you are the most valuable thing I've ever found. Grace felt breathless, caught between caution and the undeniable pull she felt toward this man. What exactly are you proposing? Stay at your homestead for now, Blake said. I'll have deputies check on you regularly until Montgomery's trial. Meanwhile, I'll start preparations on my land. After the trial, if you're still amenable, we can discuss a more permanent arrangement. Grace considered his words carefully. And if this arrangement between us doesn't work out, then you'll have a friend and ally in town, nothing more, Blake promised. I would never pressure you into anything you don't want, Grace. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. This was nothing like Silas Montgomery's threats or Jasper's leering advances. This was an offer made with respect and genuine care. I need time to think, Grace finally said. Blake nodded, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. Take all the time you need. They parted ways the next morning with a formal handshake that belied the emotional undercurrents between them. As Blake mounted his horse, he tipped his hat to Grace with a smile that made her heart skip. I'll send Deputy Miller out tomorrow to check on you, he promised. And I'll return as soon as I can. Grace watched him ride away, a complicated mixture of emotions swirling within her. She had lived independently for so long that the prospect of any kind of partnership, business or otherwise, was both frightening and enticing. The days that followed were filled with hard work as Grace threw herself into maintaining the homestead. True to his word, Blake sent deputies to check on her regularly, each bringing brief notes from the sheriff himself, updates on the case against Montgomery, inquiries about her welfare, and once pressed flowers from the meadow near his property in town. 2 weeks passed, and finally, Judge Parker arrived for the circuit court. Grace made the journey into Whispering Pines to testify against Silas Montgomery and his son. The courtroom was tense, with Montgomery supporters glaring at her from the gallery, but Blake's reassuring presence at the prosecutor's table gave her the courage to tell her story clearly and confidently. When the judge sentenced Silas and Jasper Montgomery to 15 years in territorial prison for attempted kidnapping, extortion, and assault, Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The Montgomery reign of terror over the valley was finally ending. After the trial, Blake walked her to the hotel where she would stay the night before returning to her homestead. "You were magnificent in there," he told her, his admiration evident. "Not many would have stood up to the Montgomerys the way you did." Grace smiled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Having you there made it easier. They paused at the hotel entrance, suddenly awkward in the bustle of the town's main street. "Grace," Blake began, removing his hat. "I've been working on that cabin I told you about. It's coming along well." "Is that so?" Grace replied, her heart quickening. "I'd like to show it to you," he continued. "No obligations, just so you can see it for yourself." "I'd like that," Grace decided, surprising herself with how easily the answer came. The next day, Blake took her to his property on the outskirts of town. The cabin was indeed small but solidly built, with a new roof and freshly chinked logs. Behind it stretched a lush meadow bordered by a clear stream perfect grazing for horses. "It's lovely," Grace said honestly, picturing how it might look with corrals and a small stable. "You've done good work here." "It still needs a woman's touch," Blake replied, watching her expression carefully, "and some horses to make it come alive." Grace turned to face him fully. "Blake, are you asking me to marry you?" His eyes, steady as always, met hers without hesitation. "I am. I know it's fast, and I know you value your independence, but I think we could build something special together, Grace. Something that honors your father's dream while creating our own." Grace studied the man before her, this steady, honorable sheriff who had rescued her not just from a forced marriage, but from the loneliness she had denied for too long. "Yes," she said simply, her heart certain despite the whirlwind nature of their courtship. "I will marry you, Blake O'Malley." His smile was radiant as he closed the distance between them, his hands gently framing her face. "May I kiss you, Miss Ellis?" "Please do, Sheriff," she whispered, tilting her face up to his. Their first kiss was tender and unhurried, a promise of all that would follow. When they parted, Blake rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed in contentment. "We'll keep your homestead too," he murmured. "Use it for breeding stock, maybe build it up for one of our children someday." The thought of children, their children, brought a flush of joy to Grace's cheeks. "I'd like that very much." They were married a month later in a simple ceremony in Whispering Pines' small church. Grace wore a new dress of pale blue silk ordered specially from Denver, and Blake stood tall in a black suit, his badge polished to a shine on his chest. As they exchanged vows, Grace thought of her parents and the love they had shared. She knew they would approve of the man she had chosen, or perhaps the man who had chosen her, riding into her life at precisely the moment she needed him most. Their life together unfolded with the seasons. The horse breeding operation flourished, with Blake's business acumen complementing Grace's expertise with the animals. Their first foal born on the new property was named Destiny, a nod to the fortunate chance that had brought them together. A year after their wedding, Grace gave birth to a daughter, followed by twin sons 2 years later. The cabin expanded along with their family, becoming a proper ranch house surrounded by corrals of fine horses that drew buyers from as far away as California. Blake eventually handed over his sheriff's badge to his most trusted deputy, focusing instead on their growing ranch and family. He never regretted the choice, often telling Grace that saving her that day was the best thing he'd ever done with his badge. On their 5th anniversary, Blake presented Grace with a special gift, a framed deed to her father's original homestead, now officially part of the O'Malley Ranch holdings. "I want our children to know where their mother came from," he explained as Grace traced the familiar property lines with her finger. "To understand the courage it took for you to stand your ground that day." Grace smiled, thinking of how far they had come from that terrible morning when Silas Montgomery had tried to force her into marriage at gunpoint. "I'm glad you walked in with your 6-shooter raised," she told her husband, leaning into his embrace, "but I'm even more glad you stayed." "Always," Blake promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Some things are just meant to be." Standing together on the porch of the home they had built with love and determination, watching their children play in the yard where horses grazed peacefully in the distance, Grace knew with absolute certainty that he was right. Their love story, born from danger but nurtured with respect and partnership, was indeed exactly as it was meant to be.